Hi, welcome to your Anatomy and Physiology modules with Drummond Education. This module is going to be focusing in on the energy systems, specifically looking at how the body creates and uses energy. Unit 1, the energy systems. Across this unit, we'll be taking a little look at how to recognise adenosine triphosphate, also referred to as ATP, as a molecule that is broken down to create energy for the body. Recognise how ATP is broken down to produce energy. Name the three main energy systems that resynthesize ATP. Recognise the role of the main nutrients in the production of energy/ATP. Describe how the three energy systems are used during aerobic and anaerobic exercise. Recognise the interaction of the energy systems during exercise. And recognise factors that influence the energy system used to include intensity, duration, and individual fitness levels. Energy. Our body requires energy to power locomotion or movement, generate heat, and grow or repair tissues. Things that energy is required for: movement, force production, cell and tissue formation, neural or nervous function, maintaining homeostasis, metabolism, and all organ function. Energy is essential for all of these vital processes. So across this module, we're going to look at how the body creates and uses energy. Energy systems. Energy is needed for all physical movement to maintain body temperature and support all metabolic activities. This energy comes from a substance which is known as adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. So all physical movement requires a breakdown of ATP. ATP, like I said, is known as adenosine triphosphate, and it's referred to as the body's energy currency. It's the only fuel that human body recognizes and uses. And without ATP, the body would cease to be alive. Food and drinks we ingest provide us with energy, such as carbohydrates, fat, and protein, with which to rebuild our very limited stores of ATP when they've been used up. We have a very limited storage of ATP in the muscles, so any movement that lasts longer than just a few seconds will require more ATP to be generated. ATP is composed of one adenosine molecule bound with three phosphate molecules, giving it its name adenosine triphosphate, commonly referred to as ATP. ATP releases its energy when one of its high energy bonds between the phosphates is broken, and ATP would then be converted to what is known as ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, which means one adenosine molecule and two phosphates. When this high energy bond is broken, energy is released. There is very limited storage of ATP within the muscles, and this will only last for approximately 1 to 2 seconds. So the body is then required to resynthesize ATP to produce more energy. And this is done by the breakdown of carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Energy from food. Energy in ATP is produced in the body by the breakdown of carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are broken down during the digestion process into what is known as glucose. And glucose is the most readily available energy source, which is quickest to synthesize into ATP. Any excess glucose is stored as what is known as glycogen in our muscles and liver. The second macronutrient is dietary fats. Dietary fats are broken down into what are known as fatty acids. Fatty acids are used to create ATP, as well as being essential for lots of other bodily processes. Any excess fatty acids that aren't used in bodily processes or creating ATP would be stored as adipose tissue, which is known as body fat. And the final macronutrient is protein. Protein is broken down into what is known as amino acids, and amino acids are often referred to as the building blocks of the body. Amino acids are used for growth and repair of all bodily tissues. Sometimes people just assume that protein and amino acids is only for building muscle. However, every single body tissue type needs protein to support growth and repair. This includes teeth, hair, skin, cells, organs, all of which require amino acids. Carbohydrates and dietary fats, when broken down, are the most readily available fuel sources for producing ATP. When it comes to energy production, we're now going to look at the ATP breakdown. Here you have an adenosine molecule with 3 phosphates. So this is going to be your ATP, often referred to as your energy currency. ATP allows you to be able to purchase energy. So by breaking one of the phosphates off or handing one of the phosphates over as if you were handing over money, you're allowed to purchase what is known as energy. You need ATP if you want to create energy. So once you've purchased energy, you're then left with what would be your change from your purchase. And this is known as ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So as you can see, you've lost one of your 3 phosphates from ATP, and you now have the change left over from your purchase of energy, which is known as ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So to purchase energy, you hand over your ATP, you spend and break one of your phosphates off, and you're left with ADP as your change. If you want to resynthesize ATP or reproduce ATP to be able to purchase more energy, you need to then go to your stores, which is almost like going to your bank account. You need to go to the stores and your bank to then be able to create more ATP to then be able to produce more energy. The rate that you're able to reproduce ATP will all be determined on the intensity as well as some other factors that will influence the ability to resynthesize ATP. We're now going to take a little look at the 3 energy systems which produce ATP. You have the phosphocreatine system, the lactic acid system, and the aerobic system. These 3 systems are all used to resynthesize ATP, but they're each specialized at recreating ATP dependent upon the intensity of the exercise. The phosphocreatine system is used during the most extreme and intense exercises, whereas aerobic system at the other end of the spectrum for your less intense and more aerobic-based activities. We're now going to look into these 3 systems in a little bit more depth. So the 3 energy systems. The phosphocreatine system requires no oxygen. Therefore, it is referred to as an anaerobic energy system. The phosphocreatine system is fueled entirely by creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is produced and created within our livers. Phosphocreatine is going to be predominantly used by strength and power movements. And the phosphocreatine system is used for activities that are very high intensity, and because of the high intensity, they have to be very short duration, lasting around about 6 to 10 seconds. The lactic acid system, again, no oxygen is required. This means that both the phosphocreatine and the lactic acid system are referred to as anaerobic energy systems. All this means is that they do not use oxygen when they're creating the energy or when they're creating the ATP. But because of this, it usually means that they're used for high intensity exercise and they only last for such a short duration because they do not use oxygen to support the process of creating ATP. The lactic acid system is fueled entirely and only by glucose. Remember, glucose is broken down from carbohydrates and can be stored in the body as glycogen. So the body might use glucose that is traveling around the bloodstream, or it can go to the stores of glycogen and convert that glycogen back into glucose. The lactic acid system is going to be predominantly used during sprints and maximal efforts, as well as resistance training. Moderate to high intensity exercises, also short duration exercises, lasting a maximum of around about 90 seconds. And you'll have heard that word lactic acid before, because the waste product of the lactic acid system is lactic acid, because you do not have oxygen there to remove the lactic acid as you exercise. And that feeling of the burn or the burning sensation when you're lifting weights or doing some sprinting exercises is the build-up of lactic acid as the waste product. The final energy system is known as the aerobic energy system. And there's no surprises that oxygen is needed, meaning that this energy system is aerobic. The aerobic system can be fueled by glucose, fat, and it also uses oxygen when creating ATP. This is predominantly going to be used during endurance-based activities. And low to moderate intensity exercises allow it to last a much longer duration when creating ATP, which is going to be greater than 90 seconds worth of exercise. The phosphocreatine and lactic acid-based activities are known as anaerobic, which means they're going to be slightly more expensive when it comes to resynthesizing ATP. Whereas aerobic exercises are going to be least expensive, meaning that you can continually produce this for a much longer period of time. And this is all determined by the intensity of the exercise. The higher the intensity, the less fuel storage you will have, and the more difficult it is to continually resynthesize ATP. Whereas the less intense exercises means that it's slightly easier to resynthesize ATP, and you'll be able to exercise at that level for much longer. So the phosphocreatine system, no oxygen needed because it's anaerobic, fueled entirely by creatine phosphate, used for strength and power-based movements, and high intensity and short duration exercises lasting no more than 6 to 10 seconds. Anaerobic, meaning it's quite expensive when it comes to resynthesizing ATP. The anaerobic energy is produced in the cytoplasm of the muscle, outside of the mitochondria. Remember that mitochondria is part of the cell which uses oxygen, and because the phosphocreatine doesn't use oxygen, it's not going to use mitochondria when creating ATP. The oxygen dependency is entirely anaerobic, meaning that no oxygen is needed when creating the energy. The speed of energy production is known as very rapid, and the substrate or the energy source that's needed is going to be the phosphocreatine chemical energy, which is stored and created in the liver. The amount of energy produced is very limited, which is what we're referring to as very expensive. There's no byproducts or waste products when producing ATP via the phosphocreatine system, but the duration of energy production is short, only lasting around about 0 to 10 seconds, because the intensity of the exercise is so high, around about 95 to 100% max effort. The recovery period after these types of efforts is 30 seconds up to around about 5 minutes. And the predominant fiber types that are going to use the phosphocreatine system is going to be your type 2B muscle fibers. By training the phosphocreatine system, you're likely to adapt and progress. This would result in increased stores of creatine phosphate, faster breakdown of creatine phosphate, and increased production and release of creatine phosphate within the liver. The creatine phosphate produces energy very quickly. It doesn't produce any fatiguing byproducts and doesn't require oxygen, and recovers very quickly compared to the other energy systems. Activities that you're likely to see using the phosphocreatine system could be a 100-meter sprint, a javelin throw, a shot put throw, a golf or a tennis swing, weightlifting, or a high jump. All anaerobic, all very short exercises utilizing creatine phosphate to remake the ATP almost instantly. Creatine phosphate supplies in the muscles are limited, but is rapid energy for short periods when exercise intensity is maximal. Does not require oxygen, fat, or carbohydrate, and there's no fatiguing waste products. We're now going to take a little look into the lactic acid system. Lactic acid energy system produces energy moderately quickly. It doesn't produce water or carbon dioxide as its byproduct. Its main byproduct is lactic acid. It doesn't use inhaled oxygen and can only produce energy for a relatively short period of time. Lactic acid is an anaerobic energy production site in the cytoplasm of the cell, which is again outside of the mitochondria because it is not using oxygen. So again, the oxygen dependency is entirely anaerobic. Speed of the energy production is rapid. The substrate needed, or the energy source that is used for the lactic acid energy system, is entirely fueled by glycogen. The amount of energy produced, again, is quite limited, and the byproduct of the lactic acid system is lactic acid. Duration of energy production can last between 1 to 3 minutes of intense activity. And the intensity of the activity is still going to be high intensity, ranging from that 60 to 95% of max effort. The recovery period required after intense lactic acid exercise can be 20 minutes to 2 hours in order to break down that lactic acid buildup. And the predominant fibers that are going to be using the lactic acid system will be your type 2A muscle fibers. Similar to using the phosphocreatine system regularly, if you were to use the lactic acid system on a regular basis, the body will adapt to that type of training. And this would increase your subjective tolerance to the discomfort of lactic buildup and increase your glycogen storage, and then improve what is known as anaerobic glycolysis, which is breaking down carbohydrates without the use of oxygen. It will improve lactic acid removal, increase anaerobic threshold, and be able to support you to work harder for longer. Exercises which use the lactic acid system are going to be 400-meter runs, 100-meter swims, 200-meter swims, or hurdling exercises, as well as resistance training for repetitions 5 or more. This is all going to be within the lactic acid system. Again, the lactate system is entirely anaerobic and uses stored glycogen to make ATP. It provides ATP when oxygen is not freely available within the cell, and produces a fatiguing byproduct known as lactic acid. This is known as the burning sensation in the muscles. It can last for around about 1 to 3 minutes of intense activity, and this high intensity exercise is going to be around about 60 to 95% of max effort. The final energy system that we need to discuss is the aerobic system. The aerobic system does require oxygen, hence its name aerobic. The aerobic system has 3 possible fuel sources: glucose, fat, and oxygen. Endurance-based activities and low to moderate intensity, meaning it's slightly less expensive. Aerobic energy is produced within the mitochondria of the cell, and it is oxygen dependent. The speed of energy production is much slower compared to the other 2 energy systems, and the substrates and the energy sources that are required can be glycogen and or fat. Amount of energy produced is going to be unlimited. The byproduct of the aerobic energy production is no waste products, but only carbon dioxide and water as the byproduct. The duration of the energy production is going to be far longer, which is why we refer to it as the least expensive energy system. The intensity of activity is going to be low intensity, up to around about 60% of max effort. The recovery required is just enough time to eat and drink and to replenish the fuel sources that you've used. And the predominant fiber type for aerobic-based activities is going to be type 1 muscle fibers. Aerobic adaptations to training will be increased uptake and utilization of oxygen in the muscle, improved capillarization and gaseous exchange, increased size and number of mitochondria within your cells of type 1 muscle fibers, increased fat metabolism, increased glycogen storage, raised aerobic and anaerobic threshold, and can support to increase your VO2 max as a whole. When it comes to exercises that use the aerobic system, you're going to be looking at long distance running exercises, marathons, triathlons, long distance swims, and long distance cycles. These activities are aerobic and will break down carbohydrates and fat in the presence of oxygen, and ATP breakdown takes place in the mitochondria. The waste products that are less fatiguing are carbon dioxide and water, and this is going to allow you to support much longer duration exercises because of the low to moderate intensity, up to around about 60% of max effort that you'll be performing. This will help increase cardiovascular fitness, and it will improve the delivery of oxygen to the working muscles, allowing the aerobic system to produce ATP at higher intensities. The mitochondria. The mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell, and it's the location of aerobic energy production. Remember that anaerobic energy production occurs in what's known as the cytoplasm outside the cell. The more mitochondria there are and the larger they are, the more potential there is for energy production. Training can enhance mitochondrial density and therefore improve performance. Intensity-duration relationship. Just a reminder that the energy system that you use is dependent upon the intensity and duration of the exercise. The creatine phosphate system is used when there's not enough oxygen, therefore it being an anaerobic-based activities, when you're nearing your maximal exertion and when muscles need to generate a lot of force quickly. The lactic acid system is going to be moderate to high intensity exercises, meaning that the duration needs to be, again, much lower, around about a maximum of 90 seconds to 3 minutes. Whereas the aerobic system is dominant when there is enough oxygen in the cell to meet the energy production requirements. This is due to the intensity being much lower, allowing you to then produce this for a much longer duration. So the intensity and resultant duration you can perform the exercises for will determine what fuel source you use. Phosphocreatine, high intensity, low duration; lactic acid, high to moderate intensities, moderate to low durations; aerobic energy system, very low intensity, but much higher durations. Energy systems when exercising. What we're going to look at now is how the body uses energy dependent upon the length and intensity of exercise. So for the first 0 to 10 seconds of any exercise, the majority of your energy production is going to come via the phosphocreatine system. However, the body is a very clever machine, and if the intensity of the exercise is not going to be 100% to 95%, the body will transition into the next fuel, into the next energy system that can then take over. So you can see after about 0 to 10 seconds, if the intensity is not going to maintain at that 100 to 95% mark, the body will slowly transition over into the lactic acid system. And this transition can be seen once more after around about 90 seconds. If the intensity of the exercise is much lower, around about 60% or lower, the body after around about 90 seconds will then transition into the aerobic system. So you can see there is a relationship between all three. If the intensity was really, really high, you would only stay within the phosphocreatine system in that 0 to 10 second section. If you were doing another exercise that lasted around about 1 minute to 90 seconds, this type of activity is predominantly going to be using the lactic acid system. And again, anything beyond 90 seconds is predominantly going to be using the aerobic system. But for that first 90 seconds of any aerobic exercise, you can see there is a relationship between all three. And you will use all three energy systems when starting off the majority of exercises, and the body will select and use the most efficient longer term depending on the exercise. Energy systems interaction. I think the previous slide shows that it is unlikely that one energy system will work on its own, and they will all work together to produce energy efficiently. For example, in a 100-meter swim, the lactic system is the predominant system used, but the aerobic system and the creatine phosphate system are used to support that activity. Predominant energy systems and activities. On the left-hand side, you can see there's a scale when it comes to anaerobic, from 0% down to 100%. And on the right-hand side, you can see there's a scale of anaerobic from 100% down to 0%. We're now going to label this diagram with activities determined upon what percentage, determined upon whether they're more aerobic or anaerobic. Weightlifting at around about 90 to 100% of your max effort is going to be nearly entirely fueled anaerobically. Other events that are going to be predominantly anaerobic would be 100-meter sprints, golf swings, and American football, which are all explosive power sports using 100% to 90% of maximal effort. Diving, gymnastics, and 200-meter sprints start to come down to be around about 90% anaerobic and maybe 10% aerobic. Similar to this is basketball, baseball, and volleyball. So things like ice hockey and lacrosse are going to be predominantly anaerobic, but still use a degree of aerobic systems as well. Now we're getting into slightly longer duration activities, such as 100-meter swims, which might start to expand, which might start to last a little bit longer than a minute. Football is going to be a great example of almost a hybrid activity that uses both aerobic and anaerobic fuel sources. 800-meter runs, 200-meter swims, and ice skating and boxing are almost going to be 50-50 when it comes to aerobic and anaerobic. We're now going to move into the more predominantly aerobic exercises, such as 2,000-meter rows, 1-mile runs, and 400-meter swims. However, there are going to still be a degree of anaerobic energy production within these activities. 800-meter swims and 2-mile runs are going to get into the majority of aerobic-based activity. And then the final section of cross-country running, jogging, and marathon running are going to be predominantly and almost fueled 100% by aerobic energy systems. Energy systems summary. On this slide, you can see a summarization of the energy systems that we've covered so far. So when it comes to the creatine phosphate system or the phosphocreatine system, you can see that it's anaerobic, very rapid production, chemical energy known as creatine phosphate, very limited ATP production, which is why we refer to it as very expensive. It doesn't have any fatiguing waste product. It's only used for short duration exercises of very high intensity, around about 0 to 10 seconds and 95 to 100% of max effort. It would be quite a quick recovery process, 30 seconds to around about 5 minutes, and it's going to be predominantly used by type 2B muscle fibers. The lactate system or the lactic acid system, again, is going to be anaerobic. It's going to be rapidly producing ATP and produced entirely by glycogen or glucose, which is broken down from glycogen. It's going to have a limited ATP production, again, quite expensive, and it's going to have a byproduct or a waste product known as lactic acid, which is a fatiguing byproduct, or also known as that burning sensation, which I'm sure you've all experienced. It will only last around about 1 to 3 minutes before you then need to stop and rest. This is going to be done with high intensity exercises, around about 60 to 95% of max effort. And it takes around about 20 minutes to 2 hours to break down and remove that lactic acid buildup after you train. And predominantly going to be used within type 2A muscle fibers. And lastly, the aerobic system, which is going to be using oxygen, hence its name aerobic, is going to be a much slower production of ATP, but its fuel sources can be from glycogen and fat. This is going to be an unlimited ATP production, and there's not going to be any main fatiguing waste products, just carbon dioxide and water. And an accumulation of being aerobic, slower production, having multiple fuel sources, and no main fatiguing waste products allow it to be a much longer duration energy system. And again, because it's such low to moderate intensity, up to around about 60% of max effort. The recovery will be supported as long as you have time to eat and drink and replenish the fuel sources of glycogen and fat that you've used. And the type 1 muscle fibers are going to predominantly use aerobic systems when it comes to creating ATP. What affects the use of energy systems? Things that will influence the effectiveness of your energy systems will be fitness levels. If someone's quite unfit, they're going to find it quite hard to continually produce ATP. However, the fitter you are, the more effective you are at going to be producing ATP. But when it comes to fitness levels, someone might be quite aerobically fit, and that will support their aerobic system at producing ATP, whereas others might be quite anaerobically fit, meaning that they're more effective within the phosphocreatine and lactic acid systems. This might be because their body is predominantly made up of type 1 muscle fibers or type 2 muscle fibers, but fitness level will come into play at how effective you are when it comes to using energy systems. Of course, the intensity will massively impact the energy system which you use, and because of the intensity, this is then going to influence the duration. The amount of fuel stored will impact your effectiveness of using the energy system. Remember that creatine phosphate will have quite limited stores, making it quite an expensive source, whereas the aerobic system is quite cheap in comparison, meaning that you've got lots of fuel sources to choose from, allowing you to use it for a much longer period of time. And your ability to utilize that stored fuel. If you do not train within the phosphocreatine system, your ability to utilize creatine phosphate will be quite limited. However, the longer you train and the more effective you become at using creatine phosphate will improve your ability to utilize that stored creatine phosphate fuel. The last piece of information when it comes to energy systems is discussing nutrition replenishment during exercise. So nutrients to resynthesize ATP are usually sourced internally from your body stores. But there will be quite a limited number of circumstances when carbohydrate fueling is maybe required during exercise. Some of these circumstances could be if the exercise session lasts more than 1 hour, if the match or the race is going to be longer than 90 minutes long, or if you've not had a pre-exercise meal with carbohydrates, which would not then fuel the exercise session you're about to do. That's us covered everything you need to know within the energy systems. So hopefully you're now able to recognise that adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP, as a molecule that is broken down to create energy for the body, recognise how ATP is broken down to produce energy, name the three main energy systems that resynthesize ATP, recognise the role of the main nutrients in the production of energy and ATP, describe how the three energy systems are used during aerobic and anaerobic exercise, recognise the interaction of the energy systems during exercise, and recognise factors that influence the energy system used to include intensity, duration, and individual fitness levels. We look forward to seeing you back for your nervous system modules.